Let me extend to all of you a very warm welcome to the series of Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh for the session 2017 to 18. My name is Stuart Brown. I'm Professor of Ecclesiastical History and Deputy Convener of the Gifford Lectureships Committee. Allow me first to say a few words about the Gifford Lectures before I introduce our lecturer. The Gifford Lectures were first established in 1885 by a gift from Adam Lord Gifford, a justice of the Court of Session and a man of broad learning, compassion, and cultivation. He endowed a series of public lectures to be offered at each of the four older Scottish universities, Edinburgh, St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen, for promoting, advancing, teaching, and diffusing the study of natural theology, with natural theology defined broadly as the knowledge of God and the foundation of ethics or morals. The first Gifford Lectures were delivered in 1888. And at the University of Edinburgh, our past Gifford Lectures have included such luminaries as William James, Henri Bergson, James G. Fraser, Albert Schweitzer, Reinhold Niebuhr, Iris Murdoch, Charles Taylor, and Rowan Williams. Our Gifford lecturer for the session 2017 to 18 is the distinguished scholar, Professor Agustín Fuentes, the Edmund P. Joyce Professor of Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. His path-breaking work has been devoted to the major questions relating to human evolution, human nature, human behavior, the why and how of what it means to be human. Born in California, Agustín Fuentes was educated at the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned his BA in Zoology and Anthropology in 1989, his master's degree in anthropology in 1991, and his doctorate in anthropology in 1994. He taught anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Central Washington University before joining the Department of Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame in 2002. He was appointed to the position of Professor of Anthropology at Notre Dame in 2008, and to the prestigious named Edmund P. Joyce Professorship of Anthropology in 2013. Professor Fuentes has also served as chair of the Department of Anthropology and director for the Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts at Notre Dame. Professor Fuentes has devoted many years to the study of primates and other species within their ecosystems. And he has applied this research with great creativity and insight in enhancing our understanding of what it means to be human. His conclusions, which he's drawn from extensive field work and multidisciplinary collaboration, challenge commonly held conceptions and have captivated readers within academic circles and the larger public beyond. A prolific writer, he is the author or editor of 13 books and is the author or co-editor of scores of learned articles and contributed book chapters. He has lectured widely in the United States, Canada, South America, Europe, and Asia. His most recent book, The Creative Spark, How Imagination Made Humans Exceptional, 2017, explores our ability to imagine different futures and to join together to reshape human nature as well as our ecological and social environment. And in addition to a busy academic life, Professor Fuentes dabbles in film producing, working with the director, screenwriter, and his partner, Davey Snively, on short horror comedies, which are great fun. And we're delighted to welcome them both. The title of Professor Fuentes' series of Gifford Lectures is Why We Believe, Evolution, Making Meaning, and the Development of Human Natures. And over the next 2 weeks, we will have 6 lectures. And this is a theme, I might add, that has been of special interest to Scottish thinkers. From the Scottish Enlightenment and David Hume's classic essay on the natural history of religion and onwards. And it's attracted the attention of such Scottish thinkers as William Robertson, John Ferguson McClellan, J.G. Fraser, and William Robertson Smith. It's a highly appropriate theme for a Gifford series. The lecture and question time this evening are being recorded, and a video will shortly be available online on the university's Gifford Lectures webpage. Professor Fuentes, could I now invite you to present the first of your Gifford Lectures on Who Are We? Belief, Evolution, and Our Place in the World. And I understand that along with introducing the theme and structure of the series, you will be taking us on a fast-paced, multi-million-year journey to consider our shared primate heritage, uncovering the deep roots of our distinctive sociability and our considerable creative and imaginative abilities. Professor Fuentes.
Well, now you're expecting quite a bit, so shall we begin? I want to give the most heartfelt thanks to Professor Brown and the Gifford Committee for inviting me to give these lectures, and special thanks to Ms. Anna Conroy for the help administratively and for the coordinating help making the visit possible. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the crisis faced by the university's UUK, and the response by the University and College Union on behalf of academic staff that is going on not just here in Edinburgh campus, but across the UK. Educators play one of the most important roles in contemporary society. Appropriate support and sincere respect for academic staff are critical facets of developing and achieving social justice in the United Kingdom and in the broader world. I support the efforts by academic staff to arrive at equitable and just solutions to the current crisis. Given that the Gifford Lectures are an independent endowment intended for the larger world community and not part of the university administration or governmental entities here in the UK, I am here for the next fortnight delivering the lectures in the evenings in the Playfair Library at the Old College. The very nature of the Gifford Lectures are an absolute affirmation of the critical and integral role of scholars in contemporary society. I've spent years preparing for these lectures in which I illustrate the underpinnings for the human capacity for belief, hope, and the ability to imagine new possibilities and to make them happen, or at least try to. In giving these lectures, I aim to offer an affirmation of the ideals, goals, and hopes of all academic staff in their commitment to scholarly inquiry, to teaching, to learning, and thus emphasize the absolute societal need to create and maintain equitable systems of support for their livelihoods. All right. Trying to cram 2 million years, or well, slightly, I'm actually going further, maybe 6 million years into the next 35 minutes, so bear with me. Belief is the human capacity to imagine, to be creative, to hope and dream, to infuse the world with meanings, to cast our aspiration far and wide, limited neither by personal experience nor material reality. Believing is a commitment, an investment, a devotion to possibilities. Beliefs permeate neurobiologies, bodies, and ecologies, acting as dynamic agents in evolutionary processes. The human capacity for belief, the specifics of belief, and our diverse belief systems shape, structure, and alter our daily lives, our societies, and the world around us. Belief is the most prominent, promising, and dangerous capacity of humanity. 80 years ago, in his Gifford Lectures here in Edinburgh, Charles Scott Sherrington mused that the development of the human was neither accident nor miracle. What remains, he stated, what continues to elude science is an explanation. It is this explanation, not just of human development, but of human becoming, of human believing, that we gather here 80 years on to tackle. No small challenge. Today, we have a much better understanding of the scientific processes of development than Sherrington did. Developmental biology, genomics, and evolutionary science have made enormous leaps in the past century, and even more so in the past few decades. The same is true for the study of the human. Our archaeology and anthropology have radically shifted in the past 50 years, and we're now in a new landscape of understanding, of knowing, and of forecasting. The last decade alone has redefined the very foundations of what our evolutionary history looks like, how our biology functions, and what it means to ask how we become who we are. Humans remain neither accident nor miracle, and the explanation of who and why we are is an amazing, complex, dynamic, rich, enticing, and unfinished story. As an evolutionary scientist, I am driven to understand the quantifiable origins, functions, and processes that undergird our capacity for belief. As a social scientist, I seek to place the scientific knowledge in the context of engagement with the human experience, our social structures, belief systems, and daily lives. In pursuing both of these pathways, I seek to develop a better understanding of human becoming, past, present, and future. In these 6 lectures, I will share with you much of the human story, one that offers a deep understanding, a deep sense of excitement, and some serious reasons for concern. This is a story of our evolution rooted in the scientific endeavor, in the facts of our bodies, genes, ecologies, histories, and behaviors, but also one that tries not to lose sight of the rich and equally relevant philosophical and theological narratives that run alongside and through the science. Unlike most evolutionary narratives, the one I will present here ties the explanation of humanity to our distinctive capacity for belief. First, a little clarification of terminology. For these lectures, I use the term belief to mean more than the dictionary definition of trust, faith, or confidence in someone or something. Belief is also a much richer concept than the slightly antagonistic Wikipedia definition of the state of mind in which a person thinks something to be the case with or without there being empirical evidence to prove that something is the case with factual certainty. Belief is not about being fooled by a lie. In his Gifford Lectures, the literary theorist Terry Eagleton drew on Kierkegaard when telling us that the act of believing is an act of being wholly and completely in love with a concept, an experience, and a knowledge. Believing is a commitment, an investment, a devotion to possibilities and possible novel ways of imagining and becoming, none of which need be rooted in material reality, but all of which can be infused with hope. Believing can be fearing an unknown but wholly felt entity or perception, or it can be a certainty which cannot be seen, grasped, or measured. Believing is completely real, but often without material substance. Undergirding and infusing belief is the human capacity to imagine, to be creative, to hope and dream, to infuse the world with meaning. Belief, for better or for worse, is a deeply and distinctively human process. The human capacity to believe is not simply our ability to have faith in something or someone, or our ability for self-deception, although both of these are important parts of the human experience. And I want to make explicitly clear that in my definition and use of the term belief, I am separating the having of faith in a specific set of beliefs from the capacity to have faith, which arises from our core ability to believe. This is a critical distinction, especially when it comes to the belief systems that most would call religion, because the best explanations for any particular faith, tradition, or religion come from within that faith, the theology of that tradition, or from the specific fields of philosophical and religious studies of such faith practices, histories, and traditions. In these lectures, I will not seek to explain or provide evidence for the emergence of any given set of faith practices, because this is not something that a scientist can honestly do. Rather, I seek to illustrate that the available evidence for how humans evolved and the myriad ways in which we experience, engage, and shape and are shaped by the world and one another gives us substantial answers to why we have the capacity to believe and how we humans rely on that capacity as a cornerstone of the human experience. I will touch on the realm of what we believe, but only as musings, because, as I said, the particulars of any given faith are best elaborated on by the faithful and not explained by evolutionary scientists. I gladly cede the intra and interfaith debates and analyses to the theologians and philosophers who are much better equipped to develop sincerely humanistic, philosophically robust, and theologically rich answers. Humans can see the world around them. They can imagine how it might be different and translate those imaginings into reality, or at least try to. Meaning, imagination, and hope, which constitute our capacity for belief, are as central to the human story as our bones, genes, and ecologies. I hope to demonstrate over these 6 lectures that we as a species are distinguished by our extraordinary capacity for creative cooperation, our ability to imagine possibilities and make them material, and our powerful aptitudes for compassion and for cruelty, all of which are constructive of and mediated by our capacity for and practices of belief. I propose that we can best understand why we believe by answering 4 key questions. First, who are we relative to the rest of the world? And that's what we'll answer today. Second, what key events and behaviors make us human in the evolutionary sense? Third, how did we change the world, enabling the infrastructure for the ways in which we believe today? And fourth, how do we believe? What are the processes by which we actually believe? Adding these 4 together, we can offer an evolutionary answer to the question, why do we believe? And as you will see, the answer to that question forces a final consideration. Today, in the 21st century, does belief even matter? It is my plan to elaborate on these 4 questions over the next 6 lectures. But before I launch into the main content of the first lecture, let me state that I am humbled, honored, and delighted to have been invited to give the prestigious Gifford Lectures. To follow in the footsteps of so many incredible scholars is daunting and exciting. I would never presume to exceed my own limitations, and I sincerely hope to live up to the standard presented by Lord Gifford, to be able, reverent, a true thinker, and a sincere lover of and earnest inquirer after truth. Standing here today reminds me of the comments of a reviewer of one of my manuscripts nearly 2 decades ago. The reviewer said, "Fuentes is not a philosopher, nor should he try to be one." He or she was partially correct. I am not a philosopher. I am an anthropologist trained in biological and behavioral study of humans and our closest relatives. I've spent the past 30 years in deep engagement with the bodies, actions, and ecologies of humans past and present, of primates across the globe, and as an active participant in the debates about and modeling of evolutionary processes. Across this journey, I have been enmeshed in mutually enriching, enlightening, and, to be honest, maddening collaborations with philosophers, theologians, and a range of other scientists and humanists. It is this type of transdisciplinary engagement, the cross-fertilization of ideas, methods, and theoretical grounds that I bring to bear on the data from human bodies and behaviors past and present, and that I will share with you here over these next 6 lectures. So, in response to that reviewer of 2 decades ago, I would never presume to be a philosopher, but I am a scholar who recognizes that knowledge in and of the world does not fit into the neat little boxes we call disciplines or departments. So I refuse to let my inquiry and my imagination be constrained by those categories, or to believe that it should be. All right, shall we begin? There are 3 things that we know about who we are biologically. The first is humans represent an infinitesimally small percentage of all life on this planet. The second is that humans are linked to all other life more deeply and substantially than most people think. And the third is that despite being one small part of the great diversity of life, humans have become the most significant force on the entire planet. How we became this very significant force, starting out as sort of an insignificant speck in the grand diversity of things, is one of the most important questions facing humanity, and certainly one that I think Lord Gifford hoped his founding of this lectureship would help to answer. There are more than 2 million species of life cataloged, And scientists estimate that this is probably only about 25% of the total species out there. The majority of living things are really quite small. While life is amazingly diverse, not all lineages or types of animals are equally represented in the panoply of life. For example, there are approximately 400,000 species of beetles, which is close to 20% of all the named species. Given that, we should not be surprised by the potentially apocryphal, but certainly entertaining, story about the renowned evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane. When in the company of a group of theologians, he was asked what one could conclude about the nature of the Creator from a study of his creation. And Haldane responded, an inordinate fondness of beetles. Regardless of the theological implications of beetles, we can unequivocally state that we humans are not particularly prominent in the overall picture of the diversity of life, at least not on the face of things. This is us, just here, right there. But in fact, that's not actually us. This is the lineage of backboned organisms in the scope of all different types of life. In this grand level, in this grand scheme of biological diversity, we don't come close to warranting any special recognition. We are justifiably lumped in with apes, dogs, platypuses, iguanas, salmon, and chickens. Despite our anonymity in this representation of the panoply of life, we can learn quite a bit about who we are from this. The first time I looked at a cell, I was amazed. I can remember gazing through the microscope thinking, this is what we're made of. Each of these contains the secret of who we are. Buried deep in the nucleus is the DNA, the blueprint for life. But that wasn't quite right. We are, at least all multicellular organisms, are obviously much more than a collection of cells and DNA. Most people have a very fantastical view of DNA, thinking it contains the blueprint for who we are or the instructions for making an organism. It is neither of those things. DNA is part of an amazing system of interrelating proteins, enzymes, and a multitude of other molecules and chemical relationships that cooperate, orchestrate, and interact to enable the core aspects of the development of organisms and their patterns of life. DNA cannot do anything alone, and it does not contain the secret of life or even a blueprint. It does, however, offer us a plethora of information about life and its relationships. DNA is one of the oldest shared elements of most life on Earth, and it acts as a partial record of our histories, our ancestries, and our ties to one another. DNA is passed from generation to generation, reading in its alterations and preservations the histories of past fusings and separations that have characterized life from its first humble appearances as much as 4 billion years ago. By comparing similarities and differences in DNA sequences between organisms, we can reconstruct the minute details in DNA sequence, we can reconstruct the minute details and these generalized lineages on the great map of life. In short, the structure of DNA and the way it is passed from generation to generation enables us to use it in conjunction with the fossil record to create a map of the relationships and histories of all living things. Doing so for humans, in that cluster of backboned animals, one sees that we share something like 97% of our DNA with a chimpanzee, slightly less with monkeys, about 80% with dogs, 60% with chickens, and so on. About 37% with daffodils, for those of you who are interested. It turns out that the first part of the answer, given our DNA, to who we are, is that biologically we humans are squarely in the midst of an order of mammals that we call the primates. Here are all the primates in a molecular phylogeny, and this is us here, smack dab, in the middle of a group we call the apes. And if you take even a superficial look at these apes, one might see a substantial family resemblance. But this then begs our second question as to who we are. What does it mean to be a primate? Standing in the midst of a large group of macaque monkeys early in the morning, the first thing you notice is the activity. Feeding, grooming, playing, fighting, resting against one another, exploring, watching each other. To your left, you see what we call a matrifocal cluster. An older female, her sister, her daughter, her daughter's daughter, and their 1- and 2-year-old offspring, playing around them, leaning into them, grabbing bits of food from their hands. The 3 generations of females groom one another, softly running their hands through each other's fur, calm and relaxed, mutually sharing the physical space and creating a living social bridge across generations. A few meters away, an old male watches the cluster groom, keeping his eye on two young adult males who have recently begun to push against him in their quest for social position. He sighs and, rising, slowly saunters over to the cluster of females, lays down in front of them, signaling an invitation. The oldest turns away from her daughter and begins to groom the old male. This activity, this primate way of being in the world, is social through and through. This is our shared heritage with the other primates, and the deep roots of our primate sociality form a key part of the basis for our capacity to believe. Primate sociality is particularly complex and different from other forms of sociality and gregariousness. Many bird species flock together, wildebeests congregate and travel in unison hundreds of miles, and fish of all sorts school, swimming, careening, and feeding as if they're all part of a single composite organism. But those basic patterns of sociality are quite different from that in primates, that of an intentional collection of individuals with a range of personalities, competing interests, and shared social histories of cooperation, conflict, trust, and manipulation. There are other species of mammals and even some birds who've evolved independently complex social systems similar to the primates. We can see such patterns in the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, in many canids, wolves and our close colleagues, the dogs, and also in the vivarids, such as meerkats and their cousins, the hyenas. In primates, especially in monkeys and apes, sociality emerges as more than the sum of its parts. It is the combination of a very extended and intense mother-infant bond, long lifespans, substantial cognitive abilities, and the emergence of strong and diverse personalities, along with a particular anatomy including agile grasping hands, an upper body that frees the arms and hands when sitting down, color vision, and a lack of highly specialized combat morphology. All of these together facilitate the emergence of primate sociality. Again, I want to stress that complex sociality show up in other organisms, but that in primates, because of the particular assemblage of traits, certain possibilities arise. To be honest, I think we might be in a very, very different world if orcas, what many people call killer whales, had thumbs and something like legs for terrestrial movement. But they don't. We do. The capacities inherent in primate bodies and minds enable the emergence of particular possibilities for a diverse range of relationships between individuals. Of course, bonds between familial kin are expected, but friendships between those not genetically related also play a central role in many primate lives. Alliances and coalitions, short and long-lived, social manipulations, even deceit, and changing relations between individuals as their social landscapes shift are all part and parcel of primate sociality. For primates, the social landscape is the stage for existence and for evolutionary processes. And each primate is shaped by, and to an extent shapes, their social ecology. Now, I don't make these assertions lightly. I'm drawing on more than 60 years of intensive research on multiple primate groups and species groups and populations. Many thousands of researchers have compiled thousands and thousands of hours of observation in captive and free-ranging studies and intensive investigations into primate behavior, physiology, genetics, and morphology. And as we humans are primates, the patterns and trends across our order, especially those shared by our closest genetic and ecological relatives, hold specific interest for elucidating the answers to who we are and to why we believe. We are primates. We are part of a lineage that is social to the core and for whom social interactions, social landscapes, and social connections with our kin, friends, and even enemies are central to our existence and an integral part of our evolutionary story. Primates, more than most animals, demonstrate a wide-ranging capacity to respond to challenges with behavioral innovation and flexibility. Human capacities for cooperation, collaboration, and for a deep belief in and reliance on others are rooted in our histories as primates. This is not a novel idea at all. Darwin hinted at it, and contemporary primate researchers such as Barbara King, Franz de Waal, Michael Tomasello, Andrew Whiten, William McGrew, Shirley Strum, Karen Stryer, and many more have made significant strides in demonstrating that this is indeed the case. However, I think there is more to learn from primates. There's one other piece, in addition to the capacity for complex social lives, heightened social cognition, and behavioral flexibility, that offers insight into who we are and why we believe. And that is the possibility of primates having an aesthetic sense and the experience of awe. A few years back, I collaborated with a group of colleagues at National Geographic, the group that designs critter cams. These are small cameras attached to various animals, so we get a glimpse of what the world looks like from the perspective of the animal. We designed and placed cameras on 2 species of macaque monkeys, one in Singapore and one in Gibraltar. The camera attached around the neck and sat just below the chin on a swivel, so that whether the individual was sitting or walking, we got a very good representation of what was being looked at. The data are amazing. The glimpses into the daily lives of the primates, the movements, actions, and images captured were stunning, well, at least for primatologists. We saw feeding, grooming, fighting, playing, the social world from the perspective of the monkey played out in front of us. But there was something else. Only a few instances, not enough to develop any quantitative scientific analysis, but something nonetheless. In Singapore, a male wearing the camera climbed down from a tree and approached the large 6-lane highway, dividing him from a forest patch and an enormous fruiting fig tree on the other side. He leapt up onto the pedestrian overpass and climbed up onto the roof and began his jaunt across the bridge, the fig tree enticingly close, just on the other side. But about halfway across the bridge, he stops. Now, remember, we are reviewing this footage on a monitor after recovering the camera. We're not seeing the monkey, but we are seeing his point of view. He spends a few seconds oriented towards the fig tree on the other side, then turns toward the edge of the walkway roof, overhanging 6 lanes of speeding traffic. He approaches the edge and stops right at it. We see the images of speeding cars rushing past in both directions. He's looking down at the cars moving by. He sits up, and the frame is filled like a painting, with borders of forest, a center of highways and speeding cars, and high-rise flats in the background. It's a stunning view. And the male macaque sits, watching this panorama for about 5 minutes, motionless. And we can tell if he was sleeping because the camera tilts down. Then the image shifts and the fig tree comes back into view. In Gibraltar, a female macaque named Sylvia was wearing the camera for us. We'd been reviewing a dynamic and exciting day of footage. Sylvia's hands as they groom her young son, her spats with a male and a female, her hands foraging for flowers and grasses along the steep cliff faces of the Rock of Gibraltar. Then late in the afternoon, she stops. She's sitting on the western face of the rock, high up, overlooking the Straits of Gibraltar. We can just make the outline of Jebel Musa, Gibraltar's twin mountain in North Africa, in the distance. We, the 3 researchers, are taken by the beautiful scene, but Sylvia's not done yet. She shifts her body and head slightly, and all 3 of us gasped. The scene she had framed was absolutely breathtaking. The light shimmering off the meeting of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, North Africa rising magnificently on the horizon, and the edges of the Rock of Gibraltar framing the left side of the image. And Sylvia sat for many minutes, just taking in the scene. Then she moved on. These and a few more instances are anecdotes, but they're powerful ones. Many of my colleagues who have spent months and years watching primates report similar instances, where a primate appears to the human eye to be enraptured by a scene, possibly by the aesthetic experience. These occurrences are neither commonplace nor ubiquitous, but they are interesting. We know enough about primate visual systems and neurological processing to know that we and they are seeing more or less the same thing. Can it be that there is some aspect of the visually aesthetic that resonates across primates? Can the emotion of awe be deeper than just the human? I wish I could answer that, but I can't. However, it is an enticing idea. With this brief review of what we know about the primates, I suggest that it is the aspects of primate sociality and social flexibility that offer insight into the evolutionary basis for the human capacity for belief. I also suggest, without much data, but with some interesting possibilities, that being primates might also implicate us via our particular visual, cognitive, and social systems and histories into the possibility for an aesthetic and a sense of awe that it might stimulate. But all of this is not the explanation for who we are. it only offers a critical aspect. It is the baseline for what we have to work with as primates. But humans are the strangest primate. The entanglements of the social and the imaginary, the economic and the political, the compassionate and the cruel, why humans believe, why we create meaning, are not simply extensions of a primate-wide trend or capacity. The human story is not just the primate story. Evolution is about continuities and discontinuities. As lineages diverge from common ancestors, they retain many similarities, as we do with the other primates. But it is the differences, the particular independent evolutionary paths, that represent the distinctiveness of a lineage. Our split with the lineages of our closest primate cousins occurred some 8 to 10 million years ago. That is when we began our independent and highly distinctive evolutionary journey. Our lineage is called the hominins, and a second aspect of the answer to who we are lies in the bones of these ancestors, those groups that paved the way for the appearance of our own genus, the genus Homo, the first humans. So in the short time remaining, let me give you hominin evolution in a nutshell. Here's where we do 6 million years in 7 minutes. Rarely does an ancestor look exactly like its descendants. The earliest hominins were more like the common ancestor they shared with the other African apes, the chimpanzee and the gorillas, than like us. Those ancestors were medium-bodied, mostly quadrupedal, and had strong grasping hands and feet and a fairly large brain relative to other primates. Their upper bodies had shoulder blades pushed to the back and ample movement in the arm sockets, giving them full rotation of the arms and a flattened chest. But what does this tell us about who we are? The early hominins represented a critical transition from habitually quadrupedal movement, mostly in the trees, to habitually bipedal, that is, on 2 legs movement on the ground. The shift from a 4-legged to a 2-legged primary mode of movement radically changed how our lineage interacted with each other and the world. Standing up in the trees and on the ground changed the use of hands and bodies and opened up a new panorama of communication with gestures and motions. This morphology enabled our ancestors to move in new ways, to carry more items from one spot to another, and to experiment with new manipulations of the world and each other. It enabled them to combine hands, eyes, and minds in ways that were novel and trailblazing. We have a number of fossils of the earliest hominins. Here's a brief summary. So we know a lot about the last 6 million years or so of human evolution, the evolution of the hominins. Despite what each of the discoverers of these fossils will tell you, there actually is no scientific consensus which, if any, are the specific ancestral members of our particular lineage. Ranging from the piecemeal evidence of Sahelanthropus chadensis and Auroran back here in the 5 to 6 million year time frame, to some of the 5 to 4 million year groups there, Ardipithecus and Australopithecus anamensis. These early hominins display a few things that actually are relevant to our story. They're all found in Africa. They're all small-bodied relative to current humans, and they all have brains the size one would expect of an ape of their size. They were bipedal, not in the same way we are, and they spent a good deal of time in the trees. They ate largely plant-based diets, and importantly, all were favored food items of an array of large predators. But they persisted. Between 3 and 4 million years ago, there began a radiation of hominin lineages in the eastern and southern parts of Africa, and the most likely candidates for our specific lineage were among them. In particular, we have hundreds of fossils of the hominin we call Australopithecus afarensis, and many argue that populations of this hominin form the basis for all subsequent lineages, including ours. Afarensis was small. You all probably know it best from the female representative we call Lucy. They had a brain with a size much like their immediate ancestors, long arms which were good for moving in trees, but legs and a pelvic girdle that clearly indicated frequent and apt bipedal movement on the ground. And yes, they were still the prized prey of very large cats, eagles, hyenas, and a multitude of other predators. But they did well enough, and populations of these hominids diversified again across much of Africa. And between 2 and 3 million years ago, we see multiple new lineages of hominins, including the first evidence of our own. There is evidence that this was a great time of evolutionary experimentation, with many new variations on the hominin theme emerging. We come from a very diverse and interesting group, all of whom are now extinct, except for us. Before we focus on our specific lineage, the more complete story of who we are, there are some important elements of context that need to be set. We do have some evidence of the social lives of Australopithecus afarensis, and it is generally taken as the baseline for what our own lineage had to work with, at least initially. They moved as a group, ranging over large areas of their environment. Most likely they engaged in a lot of mutual grooming and a good deal of socializing, and they probably used a range of gestural and vocal communication, but not language yet. Given that there were many predators capable of consuming these hominins on the savannas and in the trees, it is likely that predation was a significant selection pressure and that some form of anti-predator strategy was practiced. The strategy may have been to simply run away, or it may have involved group defense. In fact, one of the main fossil finds of Australopithecus afarensis, called AL333, consists of 17 individuals at a single site and might offer at least an anecdotal illustration of the lives of these hominins that is relevant to our questions. Just over 3 million years ago, in the Afar region of Ethiopia, 17 Australopithecus afarensis, 9 adults, 3 teenagers, and 5 young children, traveled across the mostly open grassland dotted with clusters of trees, but they never reached their destination. All 17 died in the same spot. The way the fossils are spaced together indicates that all 17 died about the same time and in the same spot, and not due to a flash flood or some localized disaster. While some have suggested that the entire group ate poison, a better hypothesis, given the fossils themselves, is that they were attacked, probably by one or more very large cats and some other large predators. We don't know how large the actual group was. There may have been more than 17, but it is unlikely that it was much larger. We also know that predators, even when there are 3 or 4 or 5 of them hunting together, make one or just a few kills of a group of prey and then stop to consume the prey or take the carcasses to another spot to eat them. So this means that most, or maybe even all, of the group of afarensis may have stayed to try and assist the others, and in the end, they all perished. If this is what happened, it represents a kind of extreme group cooperation in the face of such intense danger that is not at all common for most mammals, not even the primates. Such a tragic event might be early evidence of hominin groups collaborating and bonding with one another in ways that are stronger and more cohesive than seen in other animals, even at the expense of their own lives. This is anecdotal, but it's based on scientific analysis, and as you will see in the coming lectures, it is quite telling. 2 more quick notes about Australopithecus that are central to our being able to most effectively set the stage for understanding our lineage, who we are, and why that matters for developing a robust answer to why we believe. In 2010, researchers discovered marks on animal bones at the site of Dikika in Ethiopia that were about 3.4 million years old. This was the oldest evidence of animal butchery via stone tools ever found. No tools were found at the site, but there was clear that the flesh was cut and scraped off the bones by stones. The most likely candidates for having done this are Australopithecus afarensis. Again, in 2015, researchers working at a site called Lomekwi 3 near Lake Turkana in Kenya found actual stone tools, the earliest known. They're dated to about 3.3 million years ago. The tools are mostly large cores of stone with flakes that were deliberately knocked off by hitting the large stones on an anvil stone to produce specific shapes and edges. We don't know who made them, but given the age and location, it is most likely that Australopithecus afarensis gets the exalted first slot as the first stone tool makers in the history of the planet. Between 2.5 and 3 million years ago, the first evidence for members of our own genus, the genus Homo, show up in the fossil record. At this point, we know that they inherited not only our primate capacities for complex social lives, and possibly for an aesthetic sense and the experience of awe, but also the hominin patterns of bipedality and specific relations between morphology, behavior, and an intensity of group cohesion greater than in most other primates. We also know that shortly before we see the first evidence of the distinctive human lineage, our deep ancestors developed the ability to see in stones the potential of a tool and to actively reshape rock, a substance more solid than most, into new forms for their benefit. To this day, that is a feat no other form of life, save our lineage, has ever mastered. In this lecture, I offered a partial answer to the general question of who are we from an evolutionary point of view. We are primates and we are hominins and all that comes with that. But we are the strangest primate and the strangest hominin and the last hominin standing. If one just looks around this room, if one thinks about the marvelous city of Edinburgh that surrounds us and thinks about the discoveries, theoretical contributions, wondrous prose, and scholarly insight that has emerged from the University of Edinburgh, it is absolutely clear that we are more than simply a really smart and complex bipedal primate. So I end this lecture not with a conclusion, but with a beginning. Approximately 2 million years ago, our direct ancestors endeavored to succeed in a landscape replete with a multitude of large predators and a myriad of competitors for food and shelter. What did a cluster of medium-sized, hairless, fangless, hornless, clawless hominins, armed with just a few rocks and some sticks, have? They had each other and the glimmering of a new way to be in the world, a reality in which belief became a central force. And that story is the focus of the next lecture, when we ask what makes us human and answer by exploring the construction of the human niche and the development of the human capacity for belief. Thank you.
You mentioned a lot about coming down out of the trees sort of into a savanna environment, and I wondered what you thought about recent putative descriptions of a potential aquatic origin for hominids and how that might have affected, whether you totally disagree with it and dismiss it, or if not, when it has.
Absolutely. No, that's a good question, and I gave very, very short shrift to the diversity. And let me point out that it was not just coming from trees onto savanna. In fact, we evolved bipedality in trees, most likely, and then adapted to very mixed environments, up and down, around. Don't think of this old story of us just hopping out of the trees and walking like this. It's a much more complex, dynamic interface across different ecologies. The notion that we had a period of time in which water shaped the body and behavior of humans is accurate, but not in the way you're suggesting. It was not the aquatic ape hypothesis. We did not go through a water use area, but aquatic resources, such as, for example, turtles and catfish, and areas along lake edges and rivers, as I'll mention in the next lecture, actually became quite important early on, between about 1.5 and 2 million years ago, as we ratcheted up our nutritional diversity and enabled different types of brain development and physiological systems that become very important. I stress, though, we did not go through a swimming phase of our history. Apes and our early hominins all have a very low body fat ratio. It makes buoyancy quite problematic. And humans developed a very buoyant body, but it's much later. Answered everyone's questions. That's impressive.
I think you sort of overwhelmed everyone with about 6.5 million years of history, but I was intrigued by the notion of aesthetics, of these critter cameras, as you were saying, put on primates, and this notion of enjoying a beautiful piece of scenery and being in awe of something. You mentioned a couple of examples of that, but are there more?
So there are a number of examples, and I think this is particularly telling, and I mentioned it very briefly, because we see other organisms, other animals, engaging with environments in particular ways that might reflect this.
Yeah.
But we know that their visual and cognitive systems, the sensory biology, is different from ours. So we're not seeing what we think they're seeing. It may not be what they're seeing. But with the primates, we know what they're seeing, particularly with monkeys and apes. And there are numerous anecdotal examples of this. Everyone in my discipline, though, is quite terrified of trying to publish this because it's not consistent data. And how do you actually collect data on this aside from strapping insanely expensive cameras to monkeys and figuring it out? There's an importance here, though, because what I would like to argue in a broader context is that it looks like this capacity to appreciate, and I think this is probably stretches to a certain range of mammals, but we can only actually understand it in primates, sets up a type of functioning in our neurobiology and a kind of experiential reality that I think is important for thinking forward, as I'll illustrate in the next few lectures, about how we constructed a very distinctive niche that facilitated not just the capacity for belief, but the patterns and trends of belief.
Yes, we have a question in the front.
Thank you very much. It's always very stimulating. And my question has to do with the sheer range of different hominin species that you've put up at the end, and the range of different brain sizes, including hominins like Homo naledi, and the relationships between them. I'd just like you to fill out a little bit more how those interrelationships happened and what sort of caused maybe one hominin to break off, and so on and so forth. So what is understood about what those different multiple relationships so far?
So in the lecture tomorrow, I'll mention a little bit of this, but I intentionally stay away from many of these debates. We have a plethora of different groups of hominins. We know that multiple existed over the last 6 to 7 million years, and we have some good ideas about their relationships, but it's highly problematic because the record makes it difficult to test species concepts and direct ancestor-descendant relationships. So we know the idea of the niches and the spread. So what I can say is that there's an early cluster that I identified. From that early cluster, by about 3 to 4 million years ago, we seem to get this stuff, populations, that we call Australopithecus afarensis, that probably gave rise to multiple lineages, one of which is ours. Our lineage, though, lasts much longer and diversifies over a much larger range, as we'll talk about tomorrow. And the others all go extinct by about 1.2 million years ago. So there's something about our lineage that allows them to move out and diversify in populations. Now, when I say move out and diversify, many people call these different populations different species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Naledi, Homo erectus, Homo habilis. There's major debate as to what we call a species. It's obvious that there are differentiations, but what that means is constantly being challenged, especially as we increase our understanding of ancient DNA and recognize that the genes, the DNA, as I mentioned earlier, from many of these different species are in each and every one of us in varying proportions. And that the behaviors that we used to think of as uniquely human, I don't know how many of you saw this, but we'll talk about this in the coming lectures, now the first cave painters are not Homo sapiens sapiens, but rather Neanderthals. I'm more interested in the broad-scale human niche, the way in which these populations interacted, shaping the world and being shaped by the world. And I think that gets us a better example. The problem is I'm not a paleoanthropologist. I don't actually dig the fossils of the ground. Other people do that, then I assess the data. And that's very nice because I don't have a stake in which one is the first or which one is the most important. I'm interested in the fluidity of the relationships and the dynamics that get us there. So we know a lot about the patterns and processes writ large, and there's very good and very informed debate about what to call these things. But I'm not going to bring that to the fore here because then we could just fight about whether Neanderthals are human, or even better, down the road, whether if Neanderthals are human, did they have a soul?
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. Those of us who are not anthropologists or really au fait with the evolution that you're describing, I've often been told that squids and octopuses have a sort of brain function and brain capacities much closer to human beings than you'd expect from their being placed very much on a different line in the evolutionary scheme. I wonder if you want to just comment on that, whether we've been sold a pup or whether there is something really we should be taking more seriously out there.
So I think, and this is where the contemporary understandings of neurobiology and neurogenesis come to the fore. It's extremely complicated, and the best neurobiologists admit right up front 2 things. One, computers or machines are the absolute worst model or comparison to use for a brain, any brain. And the second is that much more diversity in function is common over a much wider range of organisms than we previously understood. So two things that characterize our lineage, which again I'll talk about later in later lectures, and that is an expansion in brain size, which we know is important, but size doesn't get you everything, right? Otherwise, blue whales would be running the planet. But the different density of neurons, dendrites, the mechanisms of information transfer within those neurons, and the differential growth of the parts of the brain. So for example, and I'll elaborate a little bit on this on the fourth lecture, in our lineage, our brain grew relative to all other primates. Our brains are about six times the size they should be for our bodies, given a general mammal. But they didn't grow allometrically. That is, not each part didn't scale up at the same size. What happens is different parts augmented at different rates. And therein lies some of the possibilities. A good example for a similar type of study is that of octopi, right? Or octopuses, sorry. When you study the neural network of an octopus, they've achieved incredible neurobiological functioning through a completely different system of connecting neurons together, and yet are quite capable of incredible problem solving and some very active morphological adaptations that humans could never do. And so when I argue that humans are very distinctive and particularly interesting in these ways, it is not to deny that other organisms are also particularly impressive and distinctive in their ways. But, as I will repeat again and again and again, no other organism has global ecologies, is pushing the Earth to a global climate crisis, imprisons and deports members of its own species, or gives lectures like this. And so I'm particularly interested in what is it distinctively about us. It is not just the brain, but our understandings of neurobiology have enabled us to ask much better questions. So it's not just that the brain got bigger. Our brain size had achieved this by 500,000 years ago. So obviously it's not all about size, but size sets the template, much as primates set the template, much as the hominin evolution set the template, but then we have distinctively modified that in many ways.
Can I go back to the beginning of the lecture and ask why you opted for the term belief? I appreciate the distinction between belief and belief systems, rituals, practices, theologies, but why belief instead of imagination, say? Are you just sort of setting the game because of the nature of the lecture series, or is there something distinctive that you'll tell me I need to come back in a few days for that distinguishes between belief and imaginative possibilities?
Yes. So my point is, and this is problematic in giving the wonderful and incredibly humbling opportunity to give lectures in this context with the kind of freedom that is written in to the trust of Lord Gifford, but also the context to take 6 lectures to talk about this theme. And I do firmly come down on an argument that belief is more than imagination, that in fact there is something powerful about the conceptualization of belief that is quite distinctive and gets us a little bit further, because although my last book is subtitled How Imagination Makes Humans Distinctive, that's true, but belief is actually a more important conceptualization and deployment of that imagination plus other capacities, especially in light of the contemporary world. And so I hope to make that argument. And in these lectures, I will, in the 5th lecture, use the example of religion and religiousness to hopefully demonstrate that. But I could equally do, and I intend on writing, on using the belief systems in economics, right? Our belief in economics and our belief in love, all as possibilities of ways of thinking through this that show that the term and the way I will specifically define belief gives us an extra toolkit relative to just imagination. Although I think imagination is absolutely incredible, but one can make a strong argument for other types of imagination in other organisms. I don't think, at least the way I'm using it, we can make an argument for belief in other organisms.
We've had a brilliant first Gifford Lecture. Professor Fuentes has defined the big questions that we will be exploring in the series. He's defined his terms, the vital concept of belief. Then he introduced our primate origins, sociability of primates, and that intriguing concept, for me at least, of a sense of aesthetics, a love of the beautiful, experience of awe. We might call the beauty of holiness that primates seem to be sharing with us. He looked at the hominin groups, the clusters, stone tools, complex social arrangements, but also another intriguing idea, the idea of sacrifice or self-sacrifice for others within the group. He's shown a real gift for capturing the essence of the questions that we should be asking. Style is a matter of both inclusion and exclusion, and in exploring 6 million years of history, he's done a beautiful job of what to include and what to exclude. And I found the lecture, too, to be very affirming in its tone, especially in these difficult times, about who we are and what our prospects might be. So, could you join me again in thanking our lecturer, both for his lecture and the response to our questions?